Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we return to the agony that all of us are bearing witness to in the Middle East generally, and in Gaza in particular. I say the Middle East generally because as we convene this session, the world is holding its breath to see how President Biden and the United States are going to exact retribution for the killing of 3 American soldiers in a U.S. base in northeast Jordan. And we are all also taking in the news from Gaza, the West Bank, as Israel continues to decimate the Palestinians in those 2 areas of Palestine. I want to begin our session today knowing that this will be challenging, as it always is when one considers crimes against humanity, in particular the ultimate crime, the crime of genocide, which the International Criminal Court of Justice has now said that they are going to adjudicate by honoring the South African charge against Israel of genocide. It's been pointed out that in 1 week, Israel was formally charged with genocide at the International Court of Justice, and the court, by a vote of 15-2, said that the charges were worthy of a full case. A few days later, the world commemorated the 79th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th, 1945. And on the Remembrance Day of the Holocaust, internationally recognized, endorsed by the United Nations, 12 members of Netanyahu's government and another 20 or so Knesset members convened a conference in Jerusalem talking about the complete elimination of Palestinians from Gaza so that the Israeli settlers can fulfill the historic and providential mission of seizing full control over greater Israel. So we want to contemplate that because we are witnessing a great crime, and it's very important that we take it in and seek to illuminate it from a large perspective, which includes ourselves. In the heart of all of us lies the capacity to engage in criminality. Just like in the heart of all of us, we know we're equally capable of great acts of goodness and compassion. The complexity of the human psyche, the complexity of the human heart, the interweaving of culture and religion, belief and conditioning, upbringing, inherited traumas, aspirations for ourselves and our children, all amalgamate together into a very complex interactivity that we have many voices inside our souls. We have many vectors that seek to capture our will. And therefore, the better we understand ourselves, the more we know ourselves, the greater our capacity to recognize truth and to align what we think and what we say and what we do in accordance with natural law and the deep truth of history and progress. I want to begin by just summarizing what's going on in Gaza. And I want to juxtapose that with what is going on in Ukraine. You know, we think of Ukraine often in our world. In fact, it captured world attention till it was upended by the war in Gaza. And it's worth noting that as of today, there's been just over 10,000 civilians killed and another 10, 11,000 that have been wounded. In Gaza, by contrast, over 100,000 people have been killed or wounded in just 4 months. So in Ukraine, you have over 2 years, about 21,000 casualties in the civilian population. And in Gaza, in 4 months, you have over 100,000, 70% of which were women and children. It's also worth noting that in the Ukrainian conflict, in the 2 years, over 500,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded. One of the largest percentages of soldiers killed in modern history, exceeding even the per capita deaths of the protagonists in the First World War. On the Russian side, there's been estimated about 70,000 soldiers killed or wounded. So if you think about a normal war, you have a vast majority of soldiers that are killed because, after all, they're in the conflict, and a small minority of civilians killed because they're in the damage zone and for whatever sets of reasons are damaged or killed. But in Gaza, it's the exact opposite. 100,000 killed or wounded civilians. And as of today, the Israeli Defense Force asserts that it's killed only 2,000 Hamas fighters. So that gives you a very quick summary of the disproportionality of indiscriminate carnage that's going on in Gaza, and is the reason why the South Africans have brought the charge of genocide, because it's clear that that's what the Israeli government has every intent to do, by Netanyahu, the prime minister's own words, and easily a dozen of his ministers, people in the Knesset, and enjoying overwhelming support by the Israeli population for the elimination of Palestinians from Gaza and eventually from the West Bank. I looked it up today before coming on and want to just indicate some statistics. 360,000 homes have been destroyed and countless tens of thousands of others demolished partially in some way, out of a population of 2.3 million, displacing 90% of the residents of Gaza. The Israelis have blown up 378 schools, primary schools, high schools, universities. They've destroyed 221 houses of worship. 14 hospitals have been either completely destroyed or demolished. 122 ambulances. And there has been a systemic destruction of any and all cultural objects that have been in Gaza, in some cases, for centuries and thousands of years. Gaza is part of ancient Mesopotamia. The Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the British, the French. Gaza has been a crossroads for thousands of years, and there are ancient archaeological sites, and they've been systemically destroyed by the Israeli Defense Force, leaving the vast majority of the Palestinians without shelter in the cold of winter. And we're seeing, according to the United Nations, the onset of all manner of infectious diseases, but there's no proper health facilities anymore, and the scourge of hunger and destitution because they've blown up most of the wells, so there's very little water. In the face of an average of 180 Palestinian women in Gaza giving birth every day. Think about that. The catastrophe is almost unimaginable. And this is why the world considers genocide the ultimate crime. It's hard to take in. And that is what we're witnessing live on TV 24/7. And now the prospect is that the war is going to escalate as Israel continues to advance against Hezbollah in Lebanon, now using white phosphorus chemical weapons, which are banned by international law, which burn everything that they touch, whether it's plants or skin. Any living thing is destroyed by white phosphorus, and they're seeding it in southern Lebanon to force the villagers and Hezbollah out. And now the United States is preparing an attack that apparently will be in multiple waves against some targets that have not yet been disclosed, but it's a possibility by this evening's news. We will begin to see the escalation into regional war in the Middle East. So what we need to do today is contemplate as best we can how and why something like this would be happening in 2024 at the apogee moment of human evolution. How and why would something like this be happening? So that's what I'd like to explore today. And I do so as someone who's studied these matters for many, many years. This was a central part of my PhD dissertation at Cambridge back in the 1970s and early 80s. And that's when I received my training in Jungian depth psychology. So I'm going to be taking a Jungian methodology to explore some of these issues, because in my view, Carl Jung was the wisest of the wise of the 20th century. And I continue to be deeply illumined by the depth of his insight into the human psyche, both in terms of our personal psyche and the vast collective unconscious that informs us every minute of every day. I want to start, however, with some observation of Yuval Leibowitz, the great Israeli public intellectual, who was called by Irving Berlin the conscience of Israel, who wrote and taught during the 1970s and 80s principally, and was vocal till he died in 1994. And it was Professor Leibowitz that I think had the greatest insight into the predicament of Zionism, when he said that for the Israelis to fuse adulation of the military with religious nationalism was to create a concoction of toxicity that was going to equal the National Socialism of Germany in the 1930s. Extraordinary statement for an Israeli public intellectual to make 30 or 40 years ago. He first began to be concerned after the June 6th war in 1967 and the adulation of Moshe Dayan and the Israeli generals who had defeated, and in the defeat of the Arab armies, had seized the West Bank, seized Gaza, seized part of the Golan Heights, and announced that Israel henceforth was going to control everything. They also had seized East Jerusalem. And that's when Israelis started to go back to the Wailing Wall. So in one move, the Israelis seized the totality of Palestine. And Leibowitz understood that this was going to condemn Israel, he said, to a perpetual Vietnam, because there was no way for Israel to control an ethnic population of Palestinians that at that time was much larger than the population of Jews in Israel-Palestine, but to engage in a ceaseless escalation of violence against the native population. And that is exactly what has happened. And that fusion of religious nationalism with Zionism and militarism has created the mixture, the cultural, political, religious, spiritual, psychic mixture that has led to the genocide in Gaza. And he said, if Israel succumbed to this, the Israeli Defense Force, which originated as the People's Army, would become an army of occupation. And the great generals that fought for liberation would evolve into military governors of subject populations. And he said something, and I quote, "If this happens, Israel would not deserve to exist and would not be worthwhile to preserve." Why, he said? Because Israel will have become Pharaoh. I want to explore Pharaoh for a moment. And I want to recall this toxic mix of religious militarized nationalism, which is the bedrock of the Netanyahu government and the extreme right in Israel, which has seized the government with massive public support for what they're now doing. They frequently cite the book of Joshua, which is the first book in the Hebrew Old Testament after the Torah, after the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The 5 books of Moses account for the Genesis account, the wanderings of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob into Egypt, the deliverance of the law. The Israelites suffered 400 years under the scourge of the pharaohs. And finally, they were liberated by Moses and led out into the Sinai desert. And after 40 years of wandering, they came to Canaan, from whence Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, their forefathers, had come and had been. And it was given to Joshua, a young lieutenant of Moses, to take the people of Israel into Canaan. And if you read the book of Joshua, starting with the Battle of Jericho, the Battle of Ai, and the battle against the Amalekites and the Hittites and the Amorites, the command of Joshua in the name of the Lord was to destroy every enemy, man, woman, and child, and all the animals, and in many cases, the vegetation and the trees, particularly the sacred trees. And that's how Israel came into Palestine the first time. And that's how Israel came into Palestine the second time. And so we need to think and ponder, what is it that seizes the psyche such that killing every man, woman, and child, burning cities to the ground, killing the animals, becomes obedience to providence? Because the phenomenon that we're observing in Gaza is not modern, it's not unique, it's ancient, and has been done throughout history multiple times around the world. So what we need to ponder is not what Israel is doing to the Palestinians. We need at the deepest level to probe what all of us are capable of doing to each other, and seem to be able to do with such alacrity, with very little provocation and a paucity of reward. Because in the end, the oppressor suffers defeat at the hands of another. There's no historical record indicating any exceptions. So I want to, for a few minutes, think through what is it that goes on in the psyche that enables genocide. And I want to draw from Jung, who was my mentor and my teacher, who observed the rise of the Nazis in Germany as a psychiatrist in Switzerland. And there are many details. I'll try to keep it as short as I can, but it's a very interesting. In the late 1920s, Jung noticed an anomaly in his German patients. He had a lot of European people came to him. He was very famous. So people came to him from all over Europe. And he noticed that his German patients, without exception, which was the anomaly, were reporting to him dreams and nightmares of tremendous violence and destructiveness, grotesque beings, satanic figures in the dreams. And he remembered that right around the beginning of World War I, when he was a young man, he also had dreams of violence. But at the time, he was young and inexperienced, and he thought nothing of it. He thought it was personal. But by the late 1920s, he'd already started to explore the reality of the collective unconscious, that vast container of memory out of which every life emerges. It's the source of instinct. That's the source of most of what we do. It comes out of the inherited memory of our collective unconscious. So when the German patients began, without exception, to indicate a turbulence in their psyche, he began to pay attention. And then who appears on the scene in the late 1920s, and particularly in the early 1930s, but Adolf Hitler, with a capacity for oratory that could create frenzy in tens of thousands of people who surged into the great stadiums and public halls to listen to him. And so Jung began to look even more deeply, and he, by that time, had understood that one of the ways that the collective unconscious influences an individual or an entire people is through a certain kind of patterning, what he called an archetype. We're all governed by archetypes. And there are hundreds of archetypes that inform our behavior. You know, when you're young, you get entranced by a rock star or a movie star or a baseball star, and you want to be just like him or just like her. That's because an archetype is emerging in your psyche. Sometimes voluntary, sometimes involuntary. So as Jung began to look at the relationship between what was happening in the German patients and what was happening in Germany, and particularly with the formation of the Hitler Youth, and all of a sudden these young teenage boys, German boys, were engaging in rituals, and they began animal sacrifices. They would take sheep and goat, and cut their throats, and celebrate the blood. And that's when the pogroms against the Jews began. As Hitler said, our problem is that we have vermin that is staining the German soul, the German purity, the purity of the Aryan race that needs to be eliminated. So the confluence of an eruption of Wotan, as Jung called it, with growing racism and xenophobia and a permissiveness on the part of the regime for any kind of violence began to permeate the German psyche. And in 1933, right at the moment when Hitler was elected into power in the elections of 1932, Jung wrote and published an essay called Wotan. And he says that it was, in his opinion, as a psychiatrist, that what was happening in Germany was not rational. It was instead a manifestation of an archetypal seizure of the German ethnic collective consciousness. And it was a specific archetype of Wotan. Very important to understand Wotan and the history of Wotan. In the original Teutonic pantheon, Wotan was Odin. He was the primary god, sort of like Zeus in the Greek pantheon, or Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. He was the god of the thunderbolt, of lightning. He was a god of war and carnage. And people in the Vikings and the Teutonic tribes worshipped him. And they had what they called the berserkers. They would ingest some kind of drug, and they would go into a frenzy, and then they would go into battle. And they would decimate and kill anything that moved. That was Wotan. And then in the 6th century, when the Holy Roman Empire was coming into formation after the fall of Rome, and the Christian missionaries and so forth were beginning to Christianize Europe, the German princes, the Teutonic, the Vikings, politically calculated that they could survive longer Christianizing, because the Christian missionaries said, if you just convert, you can stay in power. So literally within a generation, Wotan, the head of the Teutonic pantheon, went into its opposite and was banned by the increasingly Christianized German, Northern European culture and population. But as Jung points out, if you repress your shadow, it doesn't go away. It will go unconscious, but it will fester. And the longer you repress it, the harder you repress it, the more malignant it will become, until finally it will start to manifest as what Freud called a neurotic symptom. And this is true in our personal lives, just like it's true in the life of nations. Whatever you repress doesn't go away. It will seek manifestation in a distorted form. And the Christianization of Germany increased exponentially till by the end of the 19th century, Germany was considered the most Christian, the most rational, the most technical, the most scientific, the most philosophically advanced nation in the world, certainly in Europe. And it was Nietzsche that realized that what was now going to come was going to be a frenzy as the German psyche would go back into its opposite, and the archetype of violence would emerge. And that is exactly what happened. Jung uses the term Ergriffenheit as a state of possession or seizure. And he called Wotan the Ergreifer of men and women and cultures. And he compared Wotan to the Greek pantheon. And Wotan could cause delirium like Dionysus, was a master of death like Pluto, would inspire and possess like Hermes, wandered the land like Mercury. And in Wotan, said Jung, one experiences the totality of the most primitive, destructive layers in the collective psyche. And he watched it, and he warned that somehow Germany needed to cleanse itself of this stain, and it did not. And then just to conclude the treatment from Jung, in 1938, Jung was invited to Yale University to give what they called the Terry Lectures. And in the Terry Lectures, he identified another phenomenon that he was seeing with increasing frequency over the land of Germany and also in Italy by that point. And that is mass hysteria. And he says the paradox of an archetypal possession is that we're all ordinary, God-fearing, church-going, well-behaving men and women. And yet, even though we are personally rational, we have families, we take care of our kids, we go to church on Sunday, we have picnics with the family, collectively, we're engaging in activities that can only be identified as insane. Going to war, the Holocaust, all the stupidities of the Germans under the seizure of the archetypal possession of Wotan. And Germany, he says, is going to go off the cliff and pull the whole world with it into an abyss of violence and destruction. That was in 1938. And on September 1, 1939, came the invasion of Poland and the cataclysm of World War II that left over 50 million people dead. Countries in complete devastation. And a Holocaust that consumed 6 million Jews and 8 million Slavs and Poles and Russians and Ukrainians and gay people and Jehovah's Witnesses and anthroposophists and mentally disabled and physically disabled. Anyone that was considered unclean and inferior were eliminated in the convulsion of the archetypal possession of the German soul. And then the war was over. And the world had to decide what they were going to do with what had just happened. I'm going to make a statement here just to provoke deeper thought. The Germans lost the war. the mentality of Nazism won the war and was channeled into the United States and into what became the nation state of Israel. And I want to probe this because it's a very deep point that we need to consider. The United States and Germany colluded with what they called Operation Paperclip, where even though it was illegal officially, both governments did everything they could to get the leading Nazis out of Germany. And if they had technical and scientific expertise, to get them to the United States. Most people don't know that. Hundreds and hundreds of Nazis were brought into the United States, given new identities, very good jobs in the scientific technical establishment, one of whom was Werner von Braun, a member of the Nazi Party, who was the head of Hitler's research to get the V rocket and the final weapon of World War II. He was brought over and made a prominent member, actually, of the U.S. military and eventually a space program. With Israel, it was more complicated. And it's worth considering the following. When Theodor Herzl established Zionism as a meme in 1898, the slogan of the Zionists was that the Jews are a people without a land, and Palestine is a land without a people. And so, beginning in the 1920s, Jews from Europe facing pogroms, facing the rising anti-Semitism in Germany, facing persecution throughout Europe, began to go down into Palestine. What they found in Palestine was that it was not a land without a people. It was very crowded. First of all, it had all the Palestinians. It was a densely populated area full of Palestinians. Secondly, it was full of Western imperialists, colonial powers. The British were there. The French were there. The Russians had certain interests in Syria. And so the Zionists made a calculation that the way to engage with Palestine would be to ally themselves with the colonial powers who are already occupying Palestine. The British and the French had carved the entire former Ottoman Empire up into spheres of influence. So that's the world in which the Zionists came in. And that is when the Zionists in the 1920s made the greatest strategic mistake they could ever make, which has led to the genocide in Palestine. They allied themselves with the colonial powers and began to effectuate in Palestine the very settler colonial practices and policies that had been used by the colonial powers over conquered people for 5 centuries, since the age of discovery and conquest. The British had no problem with genocide. The French had no problem with genocide. And later, the Americans had no problem with genocide. Because after all, the Israelis are just doing to the Palestinians what the Americans have done to the Native Americans in this country, what the British did throughout Africa and in Asia, what the Spanish did in Latin America. The European colonial powers have no problem with what Israel's doing. And that's why they all support Israel and are blocking a ceasefire. It's very important that we take this in. What happened in Germany was not an exception to the settler colonial modus vivendi of the Europeans as they conquered the rest of the world. It was simply the chief exemplification of a settler colonial power complex. And what Israel did in its establishment is effectuate that same mentality, backed up with the might of the European countries against the Palestinians. What it should have done, and if it had done, there would be no carnage in Gaza, is simply come in as part of the family of Abraham. Because as it turned out, in the Islamic world, the Christians and the Jews are considered sons and daughters of Abraham and are given special status. If the Jews from Europe had entered Palestine, not with a European colonial, eliminate the native mentality, wipe them out so we can seize the land, but had gone in as traders, as artists, as home owners, you would have had in Palestine today an assimilated population of Palestinians and Jews and Iraqis and Lebanese and Arabs of all kinds happily living together, as they did in Andalusia in Spain between the 9th and the 11th century, what they call the Andalusian moment in civilization, where Christians and Jews and Muslims lived together happily for nearly 2 centuries, embracing one another and keeping their own distinct identities in a spirit of tolerance. So the backing of the Europeans to create the state of Israel and to arm Israel and to encourage Israel to do to the Palestinians what each one of them have been doing to colonial assets for centuries was the great strategic mistake that Yuval Leibowitz was warning against when he said Israel was becoming Pharaoh. It didn't happen overnight. It happened because Israel succumbed to the power complex of the European settler colonial structure and became an expression of that with full political and military support to the present day to do against the Palestinians what the Americans and the Europeans have been doing around the rest of the world for centuries. And again, I emphasize, just like the Holocaust and genocide is not a German problem, it's not an Israeli problem. It's a human problem. When any and all of us lose track of our compassion and lose track of the opportunity to come in to a neighborhood in a friendly, open-hearted manner. And this is why, as has been noted, the United States now serves as Netanyahu's willing executioner. Because the policies are indispensably intertwined with how America has been dealing with much of the world since the rise of the American empire. I learned just yesterday something that I did not know, that in its support of Israel, the United States has been ignoring the several hundred Palestinian Americans, American citizens, that are in Gaza being bombed by the Israelis, and that the Biden administration is violating US law, not which requires that the US government do everything it can to help American citizens caught up in the exigencies of a conflict, a terrorist event, a war, to get them out. Look at what the United States government did to try to get the hostages out of the embassy in Iran back in 1979. Look what the United States has done to try to get certain political prisoners out of Russia. They become cause celebs in the American media. There has not been a single mention on any news channel about the hundreds of Palestinian Americans, US citizens, that are being bombed by US bombs through Israeli capacities and infrastructure in Palestine. That's the level of support that the United States is giving to Israel. Which leads me to the final point that I would like to dwell on. Chris Hedges, the great journalist, one of the great journalists of our time, along with Seymour Hersh and a handful of others, Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times reporter for many, many years, covering all kinds of conflicts and world events. He gave a speech that was released over the weekend that was called "The Death of Israel." And I want to conclude our meditation this morning by contemplating, what does it mean that we are in our time, through the event in Gaza, witnessing the death of Israel? The point that he makes, which when I heard it, I realized that it pierced me to the core. He said, in committing genocide in Gaza, Israel has lost the foundational rationale for its very existence. The whole world supported the creation of the state of Israel because of what they experienced during the Holocaust. And while there was mistakes made, as I've just indicated, both strategically and tactically, that ended up where we've arrived, the whole world repented for a moment of racism and genocide And everybody believed and supported the Jews returning to their homeland. As I indicated, they didn't have to go as instruments of settler colonialism. They chose to do that. And that's when they imbibed the toxicity of Wotan. Because evil is protean. Archetypes, said Jung, are like riverbeds, dry riverbeds. And when world events or an individual life path creates a certain condition, the waters will pour down the riverbed and destroy everything in its wake. So the protean nature of evil is that it never goes away. It can be transformed through compassion or a therapeutic process into the light, and then it can stay as light. But the energy, particularly if it's repressed, will become more and more malignant and will always look with an intelligence all its own for an opportunity to manifest. And if you look back over the last 75 years of Israeli history, you see the buildup of that darkness of Wotan, till finally what we're witnessing in Israel today is the same kind of frenzy that captivated the Germans. The language is the same. The propaganda is the same. The cruelty is the same. The intent to commit genocide is the same. Supported, as Germany was, in the act of genocide. And I want to stress that because that's the next point I want to make. As we're not only witnessing the death of Israel, I believe we're witnessing the death of Judeo-Christianity in the United States. Because in supporting genocide in this manner, the United States has so tarnished its reputation, so sullied its brand, if you want to call it that, so soiled itself before the rest of the world, that I believe that the world will have a very new relationship now, not only with Israel, but with the United States. And I believe that Judeo-Christianity will now succumb to forces that may leave it behind in a distorted way. Because there is no way that Judaism will emerge unscathed. There's no way that Christianity will emerge unscathed by what's going on in Gaza. And I think even more deeply, we may be witnessing the death of the West. Otto Spengler, the great German philosopher, wrote the book published in 1927 called The Decline of the West, in which he said that the corruption of the Western civilizational experiment, because of 5 centuries of colonialization, he made the same comment about the West and Western civilization as Leibowitz made about Israel when it became Pharaoh, as it evolved into an occupying power. And then came World War I, and then came World War II. And there's a certain finality, my friends, to what's going on in Gaza right now. This is not just Israel in Gaza. This is an indictment against a complexio of Western Abrahamic religious doctrinal beliefs and Western colonial attitudes since the doctrine of discovery 500 years ago that I believe is coming to an end. And it is coming to the end as the Israelites and the Israel Defense Force engage in the same kind of behavior several thousand years apart. As the colonial powers who've supported this kind of activity now support Israel to the bitter end. There's something immense happening in the human psyche. And for us to take this in, ponder it deeply, even if you disagree, everything I say, as you all know, is in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed. I wrestle with these issues. I'm just sharing with you what I wrestle with as I watch the news and look at world events. And then I come to, what does it mean to me? How can I act? I can act by standing with Palestine in their suffering and standing with Israel in its frenzy, in an understanding that they both represent what's in my own heart, and both crimes and acts of goodness and courage, of which I also am capable. It leaves me in a place where just being human in our time is almost become a revolutionary act. I felt this so strongly a couple of weeks ago when I witnessed the birth of my first grandchild. I was engaging in normalcy. And I experienced it almost as a revolutionary act. And I'm realizing that the most important thing that we can all do is simply honor the normal, love each other in simple acts of kindness, give alms to those who are in need, consider diversity as a source of creativity. But basically, to stay ethical and to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God, however we conceive God to be. And in this moment where the world is convulsing with turbulence, as Abraham Herschel said, as he walked with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement back in the 1950s and 1960s, and was criticized by conservative rabbis for protesting on the Sabbath. Heschel said, sometimes you have to pray with your feet. And I think that's what we all need to do right now in the face of what's happening. We need to pray with our feet, and we need to love with open hearts and outstretched hands. Thank you, everyone. I'll join the after chat. So any of you who want to deepen this discussion, I think I will let this be a conclusion for now. And we'll see you tomorrow. We're going to have Linda Tucker on, the great champion of the White Lions in South Africa, who's one of the most inspirational people I know, to talk about her latest work in protecting the White Lions of South Africa. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you in the after chat, those of you who'd like to deepen the dialogue, and then we'll see you, as we always do, 5 days a week, without let up, on Humanity Rising. So good to be with you all.